Hello everyone, MasterZam1001 here, and in this video we'll be going over some of the update log changes that have happened with Boxcutter 718_8. For this update, the Perfect Wedge is introduced, which means that by holding control during the extrusion process of a wedge, you can now get a perfect wedge, and basically extrusion control in general has been moved away from shift to get proportional control away from the control for shift to draw. So this is a very small change, but still one that I was a bit worried about having to do because, accidentally shifting live is definitely something we don't want to see happen. Another thing is that circle has been expanded in this release and introduces the new polygon-based circle, which will allow for reverse beveling. Another thing is that there's a new shape added of star for this particular release, which I think will be a fine addition. Also, shift to live has support added to make, and static grid is able to do knife projection. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the video and go over what's new in Boxcutter 718_8. Generally, when you're using Boxcutter, you're in boxes just like this. However, there are variants on box. You can press W and wedge to box, which makes it a wedge box. However, you can also activate draw a line and basically draw a line, which then becomes a box, and even adjust that box on the fly using control. By doing this, you're actually using a variant of the box, because this is a type of box that we made that would allow you to draw a box at basically any angle that you wanted, aiming to have basically the drawing of the angle be primary. However, there are variants to all of our shapes. So, for example, whenever you're using N-gon, you're using it in something called cyclic. However, there are times when you may want to use it in a different state. So right now I'm actually drawing just a general shape as you would expect with N-gon. And there is a way I could just press T and just solidify the whole shape, allowing me to basically cut out a panel. And if we just press spacebar and apply, that's it. However, next to it is an icon for something called cyclic. Once we disable it, we are in something called N-gon line, which means that once we begin drawing this N-gon, we don't have the beginning and end connected. It just allows us to draw this solidified line. And then of course in Boxcutter, because it's solidified, that means that we could press T and actually add thickness to this as we're working on it. So we could press E, extrude this, give it some depth, and we could even give it a bevel and roll the amount of segments in. And then of course, because this is an N-gon and the amount of thickness, we have to be careful with the way that we treat our segments, because if our segments overlap, as we see happening over in a corner, we get unsavory results. But we are able to basically use a variant of N-gon called N-gon non-cyclic to create these lines. And that's just another way of approaching N-gon. And then of course you just toggle it back on and you're drawing back in N-gon. So there's really not a whole lot to it. In fact, Alt Scroll is our preferable way for users to take a guided tour of Boxcutter, just going through what all the shapes have to offer, just Alt Scrolling to just see all the shapes that are there. So the next variant that I want to talk about is Lasso. Lasso is our least talked about variant of Boxcutter, and that's because I believe that it has an extensive amount of work ahead of it in order to make it completely useful for the things that I have in mind for it. However, I have been having some fun with it on a creative level, and definitely can validate its existence by showing cases in which it can be useful, which is my goal with everything. My goal is to validate its existence by showing cases in which it can be useful. And so, Lasso, it allows you to draw freeform. We've added the ability to have equidistant points, a spacing parameter, and even an adaptive system, which means that if you zoom out and you begin drawing, you won't have the shape get all bumpy. It'll remain smooth, versus if you zoom all the way in and we start drawing on a micro level, it still remains good looking because of adaptive. But there are still some things that we had in the conceptual level of Lasso that I'd like to see return. They're there for fleeting moments, but I saw potential in them that could supercharge it to have a very good use for hard surface application. So Lasso still remains a work in progress, but this is still talking about the variants of N-gon. So Lasso isn't its own tool, it's just part of N-gon. And having your N-gon open or close is just a factor of N-gon the way that we see it. Our goal is to keep the code somewhat unified, so we're having to maintain less things whenever it comes to adding new features. So we've really broken it down to these four. And so whenever it comes to custom, there is no variation. So to use custom, we'll just draw a box around this area and then press Y to make this our custom cutter. And so we can draw with custom and then hold shift in order to draw a one-to-one cut. And then during the extrude, press control in order to snap it, and we're able to cut this exactly at the same proportions as this one without having to deal with the whole shift to live thing. But we also have the variation of being able to draw it in the form of a line. So I guess I lied when I said there's no variation. There's slight variations. We could draw it in the form of a line, and we can also press W in order to wedge it. But wedging is something that's really connected with all of our tools. So really, I don't consider wedge a variation. I consider it more of a shape level modifier, a little bit higher up than bevel and mirror, but still just one of those modifiers you can put on any shape. So finally, that brings us to circle. When it comes to circle for the most part hasn't changed a whole lot. You're able to click and drag and begin drawing the circle. Whenever you're drawing circle, it actually utilizes center draw, unlike box that defaults to corner draw. Whenever you extrude, you're able to press B in order to bevel and roll the wheel in order to deal with your segments. You're also able to press tab and pause it. You can also press shift F and basically flip the shape, and as we can see for this particular shape, it doesn't actually give us a reverse bevel. For example, when we draw a shape with a box and we press B, we're able to press Q and add a Q bevel, and we could even press shift F to flip that bevel. Now when it comes to dealing with both of these bevels that comprise the shape at this time individually, that's where Boxcutter just wasn't optimized for dealing with multiple levels of bevels on the shape level at the same time in its initial design plan, so accommodations will have to be made. However, the best way to deal with that is to just shift it to live, and then from there use HardOps and go into bevel, and from there you can jump your reverse bevel down to one segment and have a much nicer shape. However, if we press D and we jump back over to circle, we actually see that there's now a subtype of circle, and previously I was talking to you about modifier, but now we're actually talking about polygon, which is the new type that builds up circle. If you were to, say, draw this new polygon type circle out at 32 rounds, for the most part you won't notice anything changing with the behavior of it, and since we're over the 12 vertice threshold, the beveling behavior will be exactly as you would expect. So you can press B, bevel it. However, the added bonus of this new default mode is you'll be able to press shift F and also get a reverse bevel, which is something that's been long awaited. Now, I did a couple of takes of this video earlier where I tried to explain everything that led up to why reverse bevel just wasn't possible with circle and why we had to create this new shape called polygon to get to this point. But long story short, anytime you're using Boxcutter, whether you're alt scrolling through the shapes, if you default to circle, currently it will place you on polygon, which will just simply allow you a little bit more flexibility whenever it comes to dealing with the circle and actually performing reverse bevels, which is a first in Boxcutter. I mean, theoretically, you could draw a box, press B, bevel it, round it, and then press shift F and flip it and shift to live, and even though this one's made of a box, we still was able to make it look just like these beveled circles. So on the technical level, you know, just breaking that down to spoil my own fun, you know, just never think of that whenever I'm working though, you know. So just showing you how easy it is to just press B to start with the bevel, press Q to jump to Q bevel, and then shift F to basically flip the mesh, which activates flip face for these particular shapes at this time. It's just the nicest place that we found to place it. However, we are evaluating different methods of actually dealing with our relationships with bevels and conveying them to users, and so, you know, our future updates should definitely be much more action-packed whenever it comes to us talking about user interaction with multiple modifiers that can occur on a shape level. Initially, Boxcutter was conceived to be kept very simple. Another thing about circle, which we're using a polygon subtype of, is if you're actually using one of these lower counts, like for example I'm using 8, I can shift scroll to get it to something that looks a little bit nicer. We can now press B and actually bevel the edges. So we'll press Q and turn off the Q bevel so we can actually see it, but being able to bevel the individual edges of the circle is something that's been long awaited. I mean, especially whenever you couple this with something like shift T to taper, and we can of course pull our cut in and out as needed to really get a very nice, interesting result. So the expansion on circle has been something that's been a long time coming, but I wanted to go ahead and get it in the user's hands so we could start gathering data on where to best go forward with it, and also to find out how well it reflects with the users. So previously I was discussing how you can hold Alt and scroll the wheel in order to scroll through the various shapes inside of Boxcutter. So I'm able to scroll down from circle and go to star. So star is actually the third subtype of circle, and the only one that I found worthy enough to be added to the Alt scroll menu. I didn't want to have the Alt scroll be waylaid by 3 variants of circle, but basically we need one circle capable of reverse bevel and star. So star is a lot like polygon, where basically whenever you draw, we're able to get additional behavior happening with the bevel. As you see, we're able to bevel the individual edges of it. However, we can also, during bevel, press Q to activate Q bevel, and we can even press Shift F in order to get a reverse bevel. So reverse bevel is just happening everywhere except N-gon. N-gon's just left out at this moment, but we'll be coming back for it. So if I take a moment to shift this to live, using the bevel modal inside of HardOps, I can actually press C, which will actually unlock the clamping on this and allow me to go just a little bit further. I've been contemplating on whether or not we should add unclamping inside of Boxcutter, but these sort of things would definitely also lead to users possibly drawing shapes that are just terrible looking, which is one of the tenets we try to avoid. So to go over circle again in depth, if you press D, we bring up the pie menu, and if you jump to circle, we see that circle will now default you to this polygon type. The only people who will be missing out on modifier no longer being the default are people who wanted to keep every circle non-destructive for editing, but this is something that we plan to come back in a future update and actually deal with accommodations for, and connect it possibly to keep screw or something, because really it was a modifier based system that was more limited, and I'll just go more in depth on that on a separate video. But just letting you know that polygon will let you bevel individual vertices up to a certain number. So to test that out, let's bring this shape in and let's shift scroll till we're at 13. And we see that at 13 vertices, we jump straight to Q bevel, and we can press Shift F and actually get a very nice reverse bevel. And to back that up, let's draw the shape again. And let's shift scroll, roll the wheel down until we're at 12, and let's press B. And so far so good. Let's shift scroll one more time down to 10. And we see that we're able to bevel. So basically, as long as it's under 12, you'll be able to bevel the individual edges as well. However, I wasn't able to find any edge cases in testing to justify being able to bevel 32 rounds of a circle, and it became an exponential bevel add-up situation, especially when we got to the reverse bevel aspect, which I feel is much more important to this particular shape than the ability to bevel every single vertex. However, even dealing with it on a very low number, there's just such fun to be had with it. I definitely got to do some content where we actually talk about this particular aspect in depth, because this shape has actually been in conception for over a year. In fact, the work was completed over a year ago for this shape. This is the third piece of simple shape. Wedge was also a part of it, but it's actually been assimilated into every shape as a whole. And then the third piece of it was, what was it? I believe it was taper. No, it was draw line support on everything. So all of these were, and star was part of it too, were comprised of a thing we were dealing with internally called simple shape, and just really figuring out the perfect solution for getting everything in the right place was a great area of contention. Everyone was really discussing and trying to figure out exactly the best position for everything. But in the end, it turned out that, aiming for a more unified solution with our tools and having everything assimilated was a much better solution in the end, because it means that you can taper with N-gon. It means you can use line box with custom. It means that wedge is a modifier happening to all shapes instead of just happening to just one shape. In fact, let's jump back to circle. We draw this shape, and while I'm talking about wedge, we can also wedge this as well. We'll wedge, give it a reverse bevel, press B, roll the wheel, unfortunately we need to add the ability to deal with individual bevels. I'm still contemplating the best way to convey that in user experience to people, because, you know, unlike HardOps is able to have menus upon menus and hotkeys galore. But whenever it comes to Boxcutter, we got to figure out an intuitive way that you're able to do it in tool that isn't terribly convoluted. So maybe shift scrolling would allow you to jump between your bevels, but of course that means UI elements would have to be added, which is a whole nother talk altogether whenever it comes to Boxcutter. So as you can see, things can get really complex really fast, but it is something that we're always working on and prototyping. And, you know, even though these things don't ever seem to make it to the light of day until they're completely finished, it's definitely something that, you know, is happening behind the scenes. So with this shape, it appears to have exposed the inside of this mesh. I believe that's what, oh wait, no it didn't. Sometimes you can't tell. That's why you Alt V and press E, and then when you have your viewport shadows, you can definitely tell if you're cutting inside of your mesh. But there's definitely something hypnotizing to just cutting out little triangles and repeating them in different places. I mean, with this particular shape, we could actually bring this down here, press H, press D, jump over to box, bring a box out to encompass it, drag this out, place it here, use Control to snap. In that time we actually did want to shift live, but I'm just going to duplicate it in edit mode. And we actually only need these two because I could just duplicate it over like so. And using the set origin tool of HardOps, let's have a little fun. So we will set origin, going from this center point all the way here. We'll press F to use the median, and let's just scale this up. And let's say we wanted to repeat that, so we would just draw a shape around that and extract it. And this shape that has a reverse bevel and a wedge and all sorts of complex business happening, we're able to just draw just trivially without any sort of issue. Of course, we'll need to lower the auto smooth just a little bit to get it to look right, but that in a nutshell is the new circle inside of Boxcutter. So in this older version of Boxcutter, we'll go up to the top bar and change our shape over to custom. And whenever it comes to custom, you click and drag to begin creating your custom shape. And generally, we had custom cater towards just really stretching your shape and getting all sorts of interesting shapes across your surface. However, later came the introduction of proportional draw and proportional extrusion, which came under Shift. Shift to draw was actually deemed acceptable and works out great whenever it comes to drawing a shape and you want absolute accuracy with the shape that you're drawing. However, whenever it comes to the extrusion process, having to hold Shift in order to get the shape to extrude 1-to-1 and then clicking to apply will always result in the shape being kept live, which results in you having to press 1 in order to change your collection and then reselecting the shape, which is just an undesired series of maneuvers to have to do to get a maneuver that's actually quite popular. While the behavior of holding Shift is something that we need to actually reverse internally and something that's currently in discussions, we did do something about the behavior being on the Shift key for when it comes to extrusion. We've now delegated it to Control. So in this case, I'm just showing you how having it on Shift and then holding Shift and pressing left click triggers a superseding system of Shift to live, which can be quite problematic. So if we press 1 and we get rid of that, we can minimize this blender and jump over to the current one and see what I'm talking about. So if we press D, we can switch over to custom, which it looks like I'm actually, custom is right here. In the Simple Pi, custom is in the exact same location. Switching between old and new Boxcutter sometimes throws me off, but in any case, we click and drag to create our shape. If we hold Shift, we're able to draw it proportionally. However, Shift is reserved for Shift to live. So that means in order to snap this exactly to 1-to-1, we need to be able to hold Control. And from here, if we left click, we see that we're able to apply the operation without any issue. And this will come in handy for another thing that we'll be talking about in the next slide, but just letting you know that you'll be able to draw proportionally using 1-to-1, which is pretty much the same as holding Shift in order to draw an equidistant box whenever it comes to drawing with box. Or whenever you're in circle and you want to be able to draw using a different alignment system other than central draw, you can hold Shift and actually change it to a corner draw, which will let you draw in 4 quadrants based on your initial draw point. However, getting back to the point at hand, just letting users know. So let's select box and we will just extract just a little strip of this, press Y. and we'll just draw in this location, hold shift, press R, rotate it 90 degrees, bring this in, hold control, pause it if needed, and from here we can just click and apply without any further ado. So while it can be a little bit confusing at this time, the thing that still makes it confusing is the fact that we need to remove shift from being able to be held during draw. So personally, I believe that we need to reverse the behaviors and actually draw the shapes out in a one-to-one state permanently, and you hold shift in order to deviate, which would actually reduce the amount of keystrokes needed in this workflow altogether and make things go a lot more smoothly. So we'll just have to see what the future holds for that, but it's still something that is currently in contemplation. In Boxcutter, when drawing a box, let alone any shape, during the extrusion process, you can press W in order to wedge that shape. However, whenever it comes to getting a perfect wedge, that, however, is something that's eluded us in the past, and it would have been nice to have the ability to snap or proportionally get a adequate wedge every single time without having to eyeball your result or use your normals to actually deal with the calculation. So this is something that we saw to improve in this update. As you see in this particular aspect, I'm just drawing wedges and just eyeballing it, and this is previously the way that we always dealt with wedge inside of Boxcutter. However, as a result of the improvements that were discussed in the last slide, we can now draw a box, press W, and during the draw process you can hold control in order to draw basically a perfect wedge, and whenever you click it will apply the operation and you no longer have to worry about it being kept to shift to live. If we had it on shift, you would actually run the risk of your shapes all being kept live after the operation, but here you see I'm able to draw wedges without issue, and it's being able to be snapped to be a perfect wedge on the usage of control. In fact, we could press Control D, go inside the helper that's rapidly getting aged, and if we look at our wedge, we could change our factor, which means that now we're drawing a wedge with it in the middle, and when we hold control, we're actually drawing a perfect wedge whenever we hold control on the extrusion process. So it's a trade-off. We traded off the ability to have shift alive being forced upon the users for the ability to actually get a perfect wedge whenever it comes to using Boxcutter. So this is one of those things you got to get in there and try, but definitely after a little bit of calibration, you'll find that drawing a wedge via this method is definitely the best way to get some wedging action done inside of Boxcutter. In fact, I can even grab the drag dot for extrusion, hold control, and then it jumps over to becoming a perfect wedge. So just letting you know that perfect wedge is now a thing inside of Boxcutter. The BC transformer is one of our oldest gizmo operations inside of Boxcutter that still remains to this day. So I'm just going to draw a shape, and we'll press VV in order to turn this into a radial array, and we'll just click to apply, and we'll bring out another shape, and we'll press VV to make this a different type of radial array, and we'll just place that one there, and we'll bring out this shape, give it 3 segments on its array, and just place it just to give it a little bit of trouble. And basically if you press Shift V, you can bring up the orientation helper. However, we're just going to check the box for the BC transformer, and what this means is that whenever we are hovering over this, we can see the various things that we're able to do with this. The one that I'm focusing on is the Shift plus left mouse click, which copies objects. So if I were to ever scroll and bring this object up, if we shift and drag, we see that we're now able to duplicate this object, and I can even select this object and roll through array to adjust the radial array of this object because of the improvements done with Array V2 mentioned in the last video. But we can also do the same with this. We could select this object, duplicate it once again as if we didn't duplicate it already, select the main element that matters. You know, gizmos tend to get in the way, so we have Shift V exclusively for just getting the gizmo out of your face, because there's just times where you just no longer need a gizmo. We'll press Q, ever scroll, bring up this piece. You see the gizmo is already on the selected object. By shift dragging the movement gizmos, we're able to just quickly duplicate this, and without any further issues we're able to go in and adjust the radial array of it without any problems. And this is an improvement compared to the previous version of Boxcutter, where basically if we were to draw any radial array and we keep it and we press Shift V, the issue you would run into when trying to shift duplicate is something like this. So that's definitely undesired. I'm happy to announce that we now have the ability to perform duplications of radial arrays whenever it comes to using the bc.transformer. One aspect of Boxcutter that I'm always seeking to improve even slightly is array, namely radial array. So for this, we'll activate dots via turning on snapping, and we'll go inside our snap panel and we'll turn on static dots. Static dots has the additional behavior of being able to be brought up via control, but you're able to press tab and actually pause the dots and have them remain without having to hold down the control key. And the best part is if you were to, say, draw a shape while holding Alt, bring it in, press VV, and perform a radial array and bring it out the amount that you want, we're able to cut through each of these particular edges, equating out from the center, and we still have our dot remaining. Normally, after you perform a cut and a face is turned into an N-gon, your dots become something much more different and unable to be used. So we'll just draw another shape, press VV, and we see that our settings got reset, but it's fine because we're able to go out and make adjustments. But let's bring out another shape and we'll extrude it, press VV, and we see that once again the settings have been reset, so we have to basically move our shape and get it exactly how we want. And so we'll bring out another shape, and we've been doing a radial array a couple of times now, and here we are creating another shape, and we had to adjust all of our settings once again. Let's bring out another longer stick. Let's try that again, and we'll press VV, and we see that we're once again reset to 3 with the same distance that we had starting out with the first radial array. So we'll bring out another piece, and as you can imagine, having to adjust your settings every single time that you bring out a radial array is bound to become annoying. So this is something that we sought to improve in the latest version of Boxcutter. So if we were to go up to our snap panel, we can enable dots, and we go in our behavior drop down for the snapping, and we can turn on static dots. So let's just hold control to have our dots. We'll press tab in order to pause these dots, so I no longer have to hold control. I can begin pondering other keys I have to hold that I need to remove our ability to have to hold. Believe me, I'm always pondering how to free the user up from having to even deal with these hotkeys. So we'll bring out our shape, we'll press VV, and we have our shape precisely where we want. So let's bring out another shape. Let's try that again. Bring out another shape, press VV, and we see that we're already near the shape, and we don't even have to deal with the count this time. Let's bring out another shape, press VV, and we're already near the location, not even having to think about the count or the distance. We press VV, and we see that we're right by where we started, and we're able to just continue on our merry little way, performing subsequent radial arrays without having to even think about dealing with the count and perfecting the distance preliminary to it, because it's actually playing off of the settings that were used previously. So it's really just a small quality of life improvement, but these sort of things definitely drive me crazy, especially when I do them over and over in practice and preparation of these demonstrations. But just letting you know that radial array now has static settings, allowing them to retain their same previous settings that were used on their last use, allowing you to perform radial arrays just a little bit easier. But we will be continuing to revisit it over the future to get it better and better. So whenever you're using Boxcutter, if you are in box and you're set to cut, that means that whenever you click and drag on the surface, you'll begin orienting to the surface. After releasing the left mouse button, you jump to extrusion, and at this point you can either click to complete the operation, or during this point that you would normally click to complete, you could hold shift in order to keep the shape live. However, if you are drawing starting off of the mesh, you're using something called view align, and if you have nothing selected, you're actually drawing something called make using world alignment, because there's nothing selected, so it's the only case to fall back to. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, we never actually had anything to do with the whole shift concept when it comes to our make box. In fact, you can see me holding shift as I make each of these boxes, and nothing actually happens with the box. And I mean, really, what would you expect to happen whenever it comes to using make box, whenever it comes to holding down the shift key? Well, in this latest update, we actually solved that, meaning that whenever you deselect something, if you draw a box, you'll basically be, that's not a box, that's a box. We could press W and wedge our boxes too inside of make. But if you're drawing a box, normally it would deselect it, allowing you to rapidly draw another one. However, if you hold shift, it will now select the object, allowing you to rapidly get in and begin cutting it. So sometimes you may want to find yourself in a workflow where you're just drawing these shapes rapidly, maybe in the form of a block-in, and then with one shape that's important and crucial, you may want to hold shift in order to keep it live and get in and make intimate changes to it before deselecting and going back to a make operation where you'll then shift to live again, even by accident, and choose to modify this shape that we received even further, deselecting and jumping back to make, drawing a few make boxes until we find one that's worthy of keeping live for just a moment for a fireside chat, and then we'll deselect it and get back to working with our make boxes. So I'm sure users are already familiar with how you're able in HardOps to press Q, go to Mesh Tools, and choose Dice, and use the Dice system in order to perform loop cuts on non-loop cuttable meshes. However, in Boxcutter, we also wanted to add Dice to Lexicon by allowing users to be able to draw boxes, press Control X to change it to a knife, press Shift G in order to make it a grid. And from here, you're able to go into Helper at any time to adjust the amount of segments that are present. And you're also able to freely rotate it, even holding shift to override the rotation. And then pressing spacebar, we are able to basically perform a dice using the grid form of box. However, we also want to be able to do it with the static grid. So if we switch our grid over to being static and actually enable grid, whenever we hold control, we're actually drawing out a grid. So before doing this, I'll go into operations and we'll just clean the mesh just to get optimal geometry. And we'll just draw out a grid. And of course, during static grid, you can shift scroll during this grid state in order to add subdivisions. However, let's press escape and talk about grid again. So normally whenever you first bring grid out, the border is white, meaning that whenever you let go of control, the grid will go away. However, if you right click and drag, you can actually bring the grid out, which will actually set it up in an auto pause state, and you can even scroll holding shift and rolling the wheel in order to add additional subdivisions. But one of the things that we also added was the ability for users to press Shift K in order to perform a knife cut operation that will use the grid in order to dice into the mesh. So just a weird little feature, but still one of those things that was just on to-do list, and I'm glad to see that static grid is able to perform knife projection. In closing, I just want to say I hope users have fun using the new reverse bevel support that's been added with Circle. Basically, all you do is you draw a shape, press B to bevel, you could press Q to Q bevel, and Shift F in order to basically flip that shape. Keep in mind that at this time, because of the lack of multi-bevel support in Boxcutter, you'll be shifting your shapes live and then adjusting your bevel using the HardOps modal more than likely. Switching over to Circle is just as easy as pressing D, and for this particular update, Circle will be powered by Polygon, meaning that whenever you are beveling your circle, if you have a low amount of segments, you will bevel every edge. Of course, keep in mind that Q bevel can be toggled off and on using Q, allowing you to get these really rounded shapes. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Originally, I had a very long demo at the end of this, but I realized that it bloated the time by about 1.5, so we'll just save all that for the second channel. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and with that, we'll wrap this up, and I'll see you guys next time.